our sins. We're so thankful for many wonderful blessings you give to us each and every day. We're most mindful of the spiritual blessings that we enjoy in and through Jesus Christ. In his name we pray.
Amen. All right, Brother Foy is going to read for us verses 17 through 29.
Indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know his will, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You therefore who teach another, will you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written, for circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law. But if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you who, even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God.
All right, thank you, Brother Foy. So we have before us another section of the book of Romans. We have the second half of chapter 2. Now, trying to remember where we are and trying to encapsulate and keep things in context, who is the context, it seems, of chapter 1, beginning at verse 18, down through the end of chapter 1? Who's the direct context of Paul's condemnation? In chapter 1. Chapter 1 is the Gentiles. Paul is just essentially giving us a summary of their failures, their movement away from God. But then it seems in chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul begins to direct his attention now toward the Jews. And as he does such, now in chapter 1, that first half, the section that we studied last week, certainly a Gentile or a Jew would fit the persona that Paul's speaking of there. And essentially it's the hypocrisy of the one who, here he said he judges others, but yet he does the same things that he judges others of. The hypocrisy is demonstrated. But ultimately what we have in chapter 2, the first half, is there is no partiality with God, verse 11. In verse 12, that God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. There is no partiality. It does not matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile. God is going to judge equitably across the board. He's going to judge everyone the exact same, because what does God ultimately judge out of verse 16? The secrets of man. Where is the secrets of man found? In your heart. So when we think about that, what is it that God has always desired more than anything else? Man's heart. That's what God desires. That's what God intends. That's what He's always wanted. He wants man's heart to be set upon Him. Now, what we see here in the second half of Romans chapter 2, in a very broad overview from what Brother Foy read for us just earlier, is the Jews they understood the external activities of what the law required of them. Would you agree with that or not? They understood the external activities. Would y'all agree with that? But what had the Jews seemingly failed to connect to those external activities? The heart. They had not connected their heart to those attitudes. And because of such, yes, they boasted in all of these things, but at the very same time that they're boasting in them, they're doing what in their hearts? They're doing the exact same. So the hypocrisy that we've already talked about in chapter 2 is even still found at this second half. So let us then list the various boasts of the Jews here at the very outset. What are some of the boasts that the Jews were making? Yes, Brother Man.
They know the law, guide the blind, light of the darkness, instructor of the foolish, teacher of babes, are their boasts.
All right, so Brother Man did an excellent job for us. He just marched us right through the various boasts that they were making. Now, before we get to their knowledge of the law, or rest upon the law, really it begins with what Paul says there at the beginning of verse 17. But if you bear the name Jew, where does this name derive? Where is its origins? All right, so typically it would have, if we go back to the Old Testament, and depending on your translation, if you're reading from the Old King James, does the Old King James use Judean there? Or does any translation use Judean? Because that's really the literal translation of the Jew there would be Judean. But that's the same term that's used all the way back in 2 Kings chapter 16 and verse 6, where it talks about the men of Judea or the men of Judah. So this was something that was spoken specifically just to the tribe of Judah, but then when Israel is taken into Babylonian captivity and they return from Babylonian captivity, it seems like the entire nation, all of those who return, the faithful remnant, kind of just adopted this idea of being Jews, and then especially in the intertestamental periods, in the periods of silence, this becomes a name that is not rather a humbling name, but rather it is a prideful name. It's something they wore with pride. I mean, just like if some of us would carry certain names. Hopefully my oldest son is proud of the name that he's been given because it's mine. He's a junior. I hope he carries that with pride or with it. So that's the idea here, is that they have put all of their beans, so to speak, in this pot. They are proud of being Jews. Well, they boasted in their knowledge of the law, but while yet you can boast in your knowledge of the law, what had they failed to do with the law? Going back to verses 12 through 16. They failed to keep it. What'd you say, Brother Jason? Follow it. They failed to keep it. They failed to keep it. You go back and the idea, is it enough to be a hearer of the law? You have to do what? You have to do it. You have to obey it. You have to put it into application. So here they're boasting in that, well, we have the law, but at the same time that they boast in we having the law, they're not putting it into application. They're not obeying that law. Then you see that they boast in God. And really, the language seems to be here. If you drop down to verse 23 with me. They boast in God. Well, in verse 23, they boast in the law. Through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? I think really Paul is bookending what he's about to argue in these verses right there. Here, their boast is in God, but are they really boasting in God? Or are they boasting in the relationship that they suppose God has with them? Not the relationship that they have with God. Y'all see the difference?
Goes back to that relationship that they posed. Abraham
Absolutely, Brother Frank. We're going all the way back to the beginning of the New Testament there. Remember when the Pharisees and all of them were coming down to be baptized of John, what did John say to them? You brood of vipers, who warned you of the judgment that is coming? Do not think that you can say to yourselves, we are sons of Abraham, because you're not. Whose sons were they truly? John chapter 8. They were sons of the devil. John chapter 8, about verse 44 and following. They're not truly sons of Abraham, because if they were, they would have done the deeds of Abraham. So that absolutely is what we're seeing here, is they're boasting in God, but it's not they're boasting in the relationship that they have with God, but rather the relationship that they suppose God has with them. Well, that carries us to this next question. Those who rested upon the law, the Jews who rested upon the law and they boasted in it, did they keep it? Here they were supposed to be the instructors of the law. They were supposed to be the guides to the blind, the lights in the darkness, the correctors of the foolish, all of those things. But what does Paul convict them of in that second section? Hypocrisy. All right, do as we tell you, but not as you do, or as they did. Turn back with me to Matthew chapter 23. I'm glad you said that, Sister Rhonda, because that's exactly what Jesus said here in his final warnings about the Pharisees. Turn back with me to Matthew chapter 23. And if somebody can get there, look at Matthew chapter 23. Let's look at verse 3. Matthew 23 and verse 3. Who has that? All right.
Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say, do not do.
All right, so what is Jesus' instruction there, Jason?
Listen to their instruction because it's right, but don't follow their example.
All right, truth is truth no matter the mouth that it comes from, right? So listen to when they sit in the seat of Moses and when they preach and teach from the Old Testament scriptures, you listen to that. You adhere to that. You heed it. But then when you see them leave the synagogue and act the way that they act, don't do that. And that's essentially what we have here in Romans chapter 2. Brother Frank.
Verse 28, even so you outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you drop back just one verse in verse 27. What had they put? They had presented themselves as the whitewashed tombs, but inwardly they were just full of dead man's bones. So again, the hypocrisy is going to be revealed. It's going to be understood and known. They were to be instructors of the law, but yet you who teach another, do you teach yourself? What is required of a good preacher and teacher? All right, what does it mean? What do you mean by role model? You live it. What was Paul's instructions to his son in the faith, Timothy? In 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12 is the one that I'm thinking of. I know that he says it a couple of different times. But in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12, let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself as an example to those who believe. If you want to be a good teacher, what must you be doing? Studying. And you have to be what? Making the applications. Practice what you preach. Now, does that mean that they're infallible? Absolutely not. I mean, we're going to hear that next hour. We're going to know that they're not infallible. I can say that because I'm not preaching this morning. But this evening, you're going to hear the same thing. Fallible men attempting to teach truth. Attempting to take what God has given us and put it into application, put it into the truth so that we can understand it. Those who instruct the law, they ought to live by that law. You're confident as a guide to the blind, but you who preach not to steal, do you steal? Well, how are the Jews stealing?
They were misappropriating tithes.
Okay. They were misappropriating tithes. You think about it in Matthew chapter 23. One of the warnings is that they were robbing widows in their homes. They were taking advantage of those who had nothing. They were taking even what they had away from them. So we see that. There, also when we think about them being a den of robbers, when did Jesus say that? You have turned my house, or my Father's house, into a den of robbers. When did Jesus say that to them? Cleansing of the temple, Matthew chapter 21.
Also, Malachi said that they were, as far as tithes, talked about robbing the temple.
Absolutely.
Next verse down, he said, bring the tithes to me so that we can buy food. My house will be full of food, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So they were not using the tithes the way they were supposed to be using the tithes.
Well,
Robbing the temple.
absolutely. And there, I had Malachi chapter 1 in the subject of, you who abhor idols, do you rob temples?
Yes.
When the Jews did not give God what he had prescribed, which was what? What did God expect of the Jews, especially when it comes to sacrifices? The best, the first, the preeminent, all of those superlatives that we want to give to it. He deserves that. And yet when they bring him secondary thoughts and just, last minute, we've got to go to the temple. Well, here's the sacrifice. That you're robbing God of what is rightfully his. So I think that's an attitude there. And then one other one that caught my eye. You who teach that you should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And the literal translation there is, you who teach that you should not commit adultery, do you have a mistress yourself? Do you have a mistress yourself? How had the Pharisees in the schools of Judaism in the first century, the schools that Paul would have been trained in the schools of thought that he's having to attack here, what had they taught about adultery? What was the question that was asked of Jesus in Matthew chapter 19? Somebody said it. Can a man divorce his wife for anything? So you already had a liberal and progressive ideology that is permeated throughout Judaism in the first century, that Jews could just divorce however and whoever they wanted to, and however many times they wanted to. And Jesus is having to attack that in Matthew chapter 19, and here Paul is saying, here you're teaching others, do not commit adultery, but yet you yourselves are guilty of doing the exact same.
What comes to mind too is the woman taken in adultery, of course, the man.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't bring an accusation against the man.
John chapter 8 is just a unique, 7:52 through John 8 and verse 11. Though that whole section is a tricky, or is a sticky wicket, as some may call it. There's just a lot going on. Any other thoughts there with the, Paul here, he begins with where they're boasting, they're prideful about these things. Oh, look at us, look at who we are. We're the leaders of the blind, we're the light to the darkness. We are the teachers of the foolish and the immature. And yet Paul lays down at their feet, okay, you're supposed to be the teachers, but are you teaching yourself? Are you supposed to be this, but yet you're doing the exact same? And ultimately it leads to Paul convicting them in verses 23 and 24 with what charge? Blasphemy. And how, or it really probably, how is the name of God blasphemed among the Gentiles? All right, you can't fool them, can you? They saw their hypocrisy, in their day-to-day activities. Yes, they saw the Jews go to temple. Yes, they would witness the Jews doing certain things and just going through the actions. But yet, Monday through Friday, when they're on the job site, what did they see the Jews doing? The same thing that everybody else was doing. Matt, you looked like you were about to say something.
Yes, so sometimes I think about what people see when they look at us in our country. We call ourselves a Christian nation, or people call us a Christian nation. So people look at us and they say, well, they're Christian. And then they see people doing all sorts of immoral types of things. And what happens is people say, well, if that's Christian, I don't want to be a part of it. It is causing, we proclaim to be servants of God, and then people see us doing things that aren't godly things, they attribute that to our God.
Absolutely.
That's God's
Absolutely. And that's really where we're going to get to in chapter 3 some. That, in our unrighteousness, God then judging us, then if our unrighteousness glorifies God, then shouldn't we not just prevail in our unrighteousness? So we're going to talk about it a little bit. But I'm glad you made that application, because I do want to make that jump. But before we make the jump to our modern day application of us in the context, Paul's quoting from what here? He doesn't condemn them just of his own self. What does he do? He goes back to the Old Testament. He goes back to Isaiah 52 and verse 5. He goes back to Ezekiel 36 and verse 22. He goes back to the Old Testament. And what did the prophets levy against the Old Testament Israel? The same accusation. You have the law. You do not practice the law. You assimilate yourself with the surrounding nations, and as such, when those nations look at you, they do what then to your God? They blaspheme.
What was curious to me, when I read through the Old Testament record, they feared God when God's people feared God.
Absolutely.
When God's people stopped fearing God,
Absolutely.
they attacked.
And so thinking about that, Jason, and this was just something as I was reading through Friday in 1 Samuel 6, when the Philistines were returning the ark back to Israel, wasn't it interesting that the priest of the Philistines and the diviners of the Philistines said that we need to do this to the glory of God of Israel? If Israel would have had that same mentality, would the ark ever been taken by the Philistines?
And they knew they had to sacrifice when they sent it.
Absolutely.
Multiple times. So they had observed something and worshiped to God, and it was sacrificed.
Absolutely.
They were mimicking it falsely.
Falsely. And then what does Israel do later when David moves the ark? What does he do? He mimics the Philistines. So there's just so much that was, when I was doing the daily Bible reading, I was just like, man, this fits Romans chapter 2. This fits it perfectly, Brother Frank.
A specific example of blasphemy among the Gentiles, verse 24.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to 2 Samuel 11, Nathan comes to David, accuses him of his sin, and he says, because of this you have given great occasion to the enemies of God to blaspheme.
Absolutely. So if the enemies can see the king of Israel stoop so low to not only just commit adultery, but to lie and to murder, to cover it up.
And he didn't say
Absolutely.
the Gentiles.
The Gentiles. All right. So now let's make some of that application that Oglesby was making just earlier. What then does the world see in us when we live out in the world? Brother Ron.
Well, Christianity is global, where, so often I hear the phrase, look at these people, they're so divided over this, this, and this. Why do I want to be a part of that?
Absolutely. So the division amongst the Christianity, and I'll delay that for the sermon next hour as an answer to that. That's why unity is so vital and so important in the world today, that we be united versus the disunity that is seen. Any other thoughts about that? What does the world see in us? Is God's name blasphemed when others view us and see us? Or do others glorify your Father who is in heaven? Let your light so shine before men so they may see your good works and do what? Glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's the objective. That's the end goal. The Jews, those who are in the context here, they had failed to make that application. Well, when is circumcision of value? And why would it be of value?
If you keep the law.
All right, it's a value if you keep the law, because does circumcision have a special right in the context of Judaism?
It's a covenant.
It's a covenant. It's a sign of the covenant that God made between him and Abraham. So there is special things that come from that. And one of the things that I think is interesting as we journey through the book of Romans, Paul never once negates God's intentions with various things. He doesn't negate circumcision. He doesn't negate the law. He doesn't bring it down or berate it. No, he understands and he acknowledges it has special rights and privileges and blessings that come with that. But is circumcision sufficient in and of itself? Just because you've been circumcised, then you're okay? Brother Frank.
I'm not sure that you're talking about specific circumcision here, or the fact that circumcision represented Judaism.
Yes.
I think that's where he's going.
So it's just pointing out the special rights of the Jews, saying, well, this is what separates us. And again, Paul's going to say, what should separate you is really, yes, sir.
I think the idea is, if you're circumcised, it's beneficial if you keep perfectly the law. If you keep all the law, you're circumcised, that's part of the law, then yes, it's of value. But when you break the law, which they all have, circumcision becomes of
No avail. So when we think about that, what's ultimately Paul leading the Jews to realize?
They must obey the gospel.
There, and I think that's, so we put all these puzzle pieces. At the end of chapter 1, what situation was the Gentiles facing? Destruction, wrath, indignation. Here, what type of situation is those who were practicing of circumcision and Jews? They're in the same thing. If you cannot practice the law perfectly, if you cannot keep that, well, your superiority has no benefit physically in the end spiritually. Well, this is a kind of off question. This really is not coming from Romans chapter 2, but were Gentiles required to be circumcised under Christ? Absolutely not. All right, give me some scriptures. All right, Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, that heated debate that occurs in Antioch. Paul and Barnabas have arrived at the conclusion of that first missionary journey. Some teachers come up from Jerusalem to Antioch. Antioch, remember with me, Antioch was a predominant Gentile church. Jerusalem, of course, is going to be what type of church? A Jewish background church. So the Jews come up to the Gentiles and they begin to teach what? You must be circumcised to be saved. It's essential.
Let me answer that totally different.
Okay?
They were required to be circumcised.
Absolutely.
Ephesians chapter 2, because spiritual circumcision is that which cuts off sin from the body.
Absolutely. So there is a sense in which Gentiles were, but it's through a new avenue. And it's through that spiritual working of God, and only God can accomplish that work. Now, one other passage, let's go to Galatians chapter 5. Because I think Paul does an excellent job here, just really answering these past two questions. Look at Galatians chapter 5, and if somebody will be so kind to read for us verses 2 through 6. Galatians chapter 5, verses 2 through 6.
Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ is a prophet, you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised, that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You have become estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. For we through the Spirit eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but faith working through love.
So remember with me the context. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6. What is Paul so amazed at with these churches in Galatia? That they have so quickly what? Abandoned the gospel for a new, which is really not a new gospel. And apparently that new gospel is the Judaizing teachers had come in right behind Paul at the conclusion of that first missionary journey, and they're beginning to teach circumcision is essential. And Paul says what in verses 2 and 3? It's of no benefit unless you do what? Unless you keep the whole law. And then by doing that, verse 4, if you abide with this type of mentality, what have you done? You've severed yourself from who? Because Christ has no benefit to you. If you're going to perfectly law keep, then Christ has no benefit to you. You've severed yourself from him. But yet we, through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting in a hope of righteousness. We're looking at Paul saying you've abandoned everything that we've taught, the gospel that has been taught to you, you've turned away from it. And I think there we see the same arguments being made in Romans chapter 2, of course, in a little bit more of a lengthy manner, possibly, than he makes there in Galatians. Any other observations on this question?
You also have the example of Titus in the book of
In Galatians 2, absolutely.
He didn't make Titus, or get Titus circumcised.
And it's just an interesting thing. You know, Titus was a Greek who was not. Timothy was raised by a Greek father, but he was. So it just, you know, under the circumstances, I think there with Titus and Timothy, we have a literal manifestation of 1 Corinthians 9. I become as all men so that I may save some. I think that's the issue with Timothy and Titus, and that would be my answer to that. Well, a true Jew is described by Paul as having what qualities? Are inwardly circumcised, and we'll come back to, but just prior to that, what the physically uncircumcised man does what? He keeps the law. Now, the language of verse 25 is just, it's uncomfortable for us to talk about some of these things because we're Gentiles and we live in a very different society. For indeed your circumcision is value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has then, let me read you a literal, but if you violate the law's command, then your circumcision means that you have effectively reattached your old foreskin. That's essentially what Paul's arguing, that here you've been circumcised, but then when you've abandoned law keeping and do your own thing, you're becoming a Gentile again. You're reattaching that which had been cut off from you. Now again, the spiritual application of that seems simple, right? When God cuts away sin from our lives and we reattach ourselves to that sin, to what benefit is that? All right. So a true Jew is one who keeps the law. And then there's something else that Paul mentions here that caught my eye. In verse 27, the one who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not what?
Be your
Judge. Now wait a minute, we began with that premise back at the earlier portion of chapter 2, right? But at the beginning of chapter 2, we're talking about what type of judgment? Hypocritical judgment. How does the Gentile who is physically uncircumcised judge the Jew who has been physically circumcised?
So the Jews have they had the relationship with God throughout their history, they should have been much farther along in their obedience to God. The Gentiles who didn't have all those advantages, they put the Jews to shame in a lot of respects.
All right. So,
It's true. Like you said, truth is truth and undeniable.
yes,
They get judged by the truth.
absolutely.
What the Gentiles are observing is truth. What the Jew is observing is not truth.
Well, they've put emphasis on external and never made the application to the inward, to the heart. Think about these passages. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 41, Jesus said this: the men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. Is that a similar application? Those who are physically uncircumcised will judge those who have been physically circumcised. How? Because while they have not been given all the advantages, they're abiding by the law. Verse 42 would be the same with the queen of Sheba who came. But then I also thought about Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he did what? He condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. Noah, by building the ark, did what? Condemned the world. So, when we think about that in the context of Romans chapter 2, and I think what Paul's saying is here, the Gentiles who have not been given the same advantages as the Jews. At the end of the day, the Gentiles are the one now judging the Jews. Now, how do you think that fell on Jewish ears? The Gentiles have now become your judge. Because by their actions, by them abiding by truth, they're showing your hypocrisy, they're showing your failures. I would think that when Paul's saying this and it's being read out loud, those Jews are starting to stir a little bit. But Paul's not done. He's going to deal with them even more extensively in just a little bit. All right. Well, then, that brings us to that final question. Where is the true Jew circumcised? Too many syllables there. In the heart. The true Jew has a circumcision of the heart. Now, is that something new to Paul? This idea of being circumcised of the heart?
It's as old as Deuteronomy.
Old as Deuteronomy. Now, who was Deuteronomy written to? The Jews. And what was Moses' final sermon all about in Deuteronomy 30? He wanted them to be cut off from what? I want you to be cut off from the surrounding nations. But yet, again, this is where our Bible reading directly coincided with some of these things. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel cried out for what? A king. Had God already prepared Israel for that day? Yes. Deuteronomy chapter 17. God had already prepared Israel that they were going to ask for a king. But in Deuteronomy 17, the emphasis was that God was going to do what? He was going to choose the king. But when Israel cried out for a king in 1 Samuel chapter 8, what type of king did Israel choose for themselves? A king that was just like the other nations. Instead of their king being, again, another point in which Israel could be separated from the surrounding nations, they chose a king to where they could be assimilated and like the other nations. And instead of cutting themselves off from the world, they became more and more inclined to be like the world.
Kobe, it's interesting to me that even that God told them to do it, to drive out the nations in the land, it was His judgment to to destroy those nations.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
man saw it differently. The exact same thing here with the Jews and Gentiles. The Jews didn't obey God's judgment, or didn't internalize God's judgment, and they were judged by someone else. So they become the ones that were judged rather than the ones that were judging others.
Absolutely. Well, then, one other passage in Galatians. If y'all, I know that Brother Jason did an excellent job in covering that, and I was glad that you did that right before Romans, because Romans, especially this section, Galatians chapter 6. Why were these Judaizers so emphatic about the Gentiles being circumcised? Galatians 6 and verse 12, they're emphatic about it because if they could at least get them circumcised, they don't have to be persecuted any longer. They were driven by merely external things. And they're missing completely the internalization. Frank, what do you always say? Christianity is what? It's a brain thing. It's a brain thing. Does it manifest itself in other things that are external? What we're doing right now, what we're going to do this next hour? Yes. But Christianity is a brain thing. And that's what one application that I want us to make this morning from reading and studying this section is we do not need to be just like they were in disconnecting what we do here versus how we act and live outside of these four walls. Because could Paul have written this same thing to us today? To those who have been born and raised in a home that has always gone to the church? Could Paul write the same things to those? To us? You should, who has every advantage? Those who have been born and raised in a home, always attending services. Faithful mothers and fathers, faithful grandparents. They should have every advantage. But yet, too often what happens with those who are second, third, fourth generation hypothetical? What happens to them? They lose conviction. So there you go. Is Romans 2 just about Jews and Gentiles? It's about us. It's about us. We've got to make the application there. All right, any other thoughts, any other applications, observations on where we are in the book of Romans so far?
Everyone is saved the same way.
Absolutely.
Obeying the same gospel. If you circumcise just for conscience sake, or if you're born in a Jewish hospital, you're going to be circumcised. But it's not a requirement, especially for Gentiles. Not a requirement. It comes with circumcision.